Mud clung to boots like a second weight, sucking at every shift in the line. Pine needles glistened with damp, and the cold crept in quietly, settling, unavoidable. Along the ridge, men lay pressed into the earth in staggered knots, rifles angled into a darkness that refused to give shape back. Breath became discipline. In the wrong moment, even a soft exhale turned into a pale flag. Somewhere downslope a branch flexed, not snapped, flexed, as if a hand had tested it and moved on. The sound slid through the trees and vanished, leaving only hush and the faint rasp of wool against skin. A runner crawled forward and stopped, face half submerged in mud, listening. Fingers tightened on cold metal until knuckles dulled. No one moved to warm them. Warmth was a luxury that made noise. The night felt crowded. Every trunk seemed closer than it should have been, every gap between boulders perfect for hiding. The valley floor waited while the upper slopes collected shadows. Far back, the rear ranks held a line. Too many men to keep perfectly silent. Too many lives balanced on a single misread sound. A cough started somewhere and died, strangled into fabric. A canteen kissed a buckle with a click. It rang louder than it had any right to. Wind brushed across the ridge and carried the smell of resin and wet wool. It brought nothing else, no shout, no crack of gunfire, only that sense that time had narrowed. Then a light blinked once from the far hillside, brief, low, wrong. It vanished so fast the eyes doubted it. A second blink answered again, higher up, not a flare, not a lantern, a measured pulse. And in the dark between those 2 points, the silence shifted its weight. Eyes adjusted and then betrayed them again, turning stumps into men and men into fog. The pulse had not been a signal anyone was trained to recognize, which made it dangerous in a different way. Training promised clarity. The dark delivered only suggestions. Somewhere along the line, a man swallowed and felt it scrape all the way down. A sleeve brushed bark. Metal clicked, hushed by a palm, too late to erase the memory of sound. Night patrol doctrine assumed movement would announce itself. That fear arrived loud. Here it crept, thin and patient. The hillside across the valley held no outline, yet the sense of eyes persisted, as if the ground itself had learned to watch. Orders traveled backward, as pressure rather than words. Hold, listen, wait. Men counted heartbeats, because counting gave shape to time, and shape kept panic from spreading. Another blink appeared, offset from the first, then died. It was not bright enough to command attention, not steady enough to reassure. It behaved like something alive, cautious, testing the night. Behind the ridge a shepherd lay still, counting terrain the way others counted sheep, knowing how far light traveled when it stayed low and brief. He had learned it from wind and animals, from nights when sound meant loss. Along the line, doubt pressed harder than the cold. No map accounted for this, no manual permitted it. Yet the pulses returned, patient as breath, inviting a choice no one wanted to make. Trust formed not as belief, but as necessity, thin and immediate. If the night had teeth, this was where they would bite. Men shifted their weight toward the dark, waiting for proof or punishment, while the valley listened, unmoving, to see which would arrive first, before dawn found them or erased them entirely forever. The waiting thinned into something sharper as the pulses faded, leaving only the ache of expectation. Men lay where the slope broke, knowing the ground here funneled movement, the way a river narrows before rapids. This valley mattered because roads ran through it, narrow and wet, carrying food, shells, and the wounded back toward light. lose the pass, and dawn would bring no relief, only a collapse that rippled outward to camps and towns beyond the trees. The calendar said winter, the maps said frontier. Neither explained how night rewrote rules. In these hills, ambush decided outcomes faster than artillery, and silence killed cleaner than bullets. Units had come this way before and vanished. Patrol reports ended mid-sentence. Boots were found without owners. The lesson had settled into doctrine. Do not linger after dark. Tonight they had lingered anyway. 3,000 men held a perimeter stretched too long, trusting spacing and discipline to replace sleep. Command knew the numbers, the risk, the arithmetic of loss. Retreat meant exposure, advance meant noise, holding meant faith in nothing breaking. Far upslope, the shepherd had crossed this ground since childhood, guiding animals between stones that hid hollows and dead air. He knew where sound pooled and where light slipped, how a blink could climb a ridge without revealing its source. Earlier, he had sketched lines in a notebook with a stub of charcoal, not plans, but habits, intervals, angles, pauses. He had shown it once and been waved away. Now those habits pressed against the edge of doctrine, not theory, terrain. If the night moved first, the line would fold. If the pulses spoke true, the valley might open just enough to breathe before it closed again. The silence waited, patient, counting them all. Cold settled deeper, not as pain, but as subtraction. Fingers lost detail. Straps blurred. Metal became only weight. Men tested circulation by flexing toes inside soaked boots, stopping before friction whispered. Hunger arrived as a hollow calm. Sleep pressed from behind the eyes, thick and sweet, promising mistakes. Along the line, discipline frayed in small ways. A man shifted to ease a cramp and felt needles burn back into his calf. Another pressed his cheek into mud to still a tremor, breathing through cloth that tasted of iron and wool. Signals that usually steadied them failed here. Whistles were forbidden. Lamps were death. Runners moved inches at a time, memorizing ground by touch, counting routes, mapping dark with bruises. The shepherd crawled closer, careful not to cross silhouettes. His presence irritated command like grit in a joint. He smelled of animals and smoke, carried nothing issued, spoke with hands more than words. Earlier, when he traced his intervals, someone had laughed. Someone else had asked for certainty. He had shrugged, because certainty belonged to daylight. Now the cost of waiting became visible. Shoulders slumped. Focus narrowed. A cough fought free and was smothered too late. The night did not react, which made it worse. Fear turned inward. Men imagined boots behind them, breath near their ears, steel sliding from sheaths. Each image stole strength. The pulses did not return. Doubt grew heavier than packs. If nothing changed, exhaustion would decide before the enemy did, and the valley would take payment quietly. Somewhere, an order waited to be broken. Somewhere, a small idea waited to be tried. Between them lay minutes measured in frost and heartbeat, the kind that turn men into survivors or names, depending on what light returns or does not, when night finally chooses its silence or mercy. A blink returned, then another, not louder, but clearer, as if the night had decided to listen. The shepherd shifted his weight and raised a covered light no higher than his chest, letting the hood breathe for a heartbeat before sealing it again. What emerged was not illumination, but grammar. Short, low pulses climbed the slope in uneven steps, each pause tuned to the ground between rocks and roots. Nothing stayed on long enough to be aimed at. Everything stayed long enough to be read. Men felt it before they understood it. The hillside stopped inventing shapes. Distance settled. The dark learned edges. The shepherd counted intervals the way others counted rounds. Wind dictated length. Fog shortened reach. When the air thickened, the pulse tightened. When it cleared, the pause widened, never repeating, never forming a line that could be traced backward. A second light answered from the ridge, then a third, offset and late. Not command, confirmation. The valley began to breathe in sections. Hands moved without orders. Spacing adjusted, angles corrected. A perimeter became a net that sagged where ground dipped and tightened, where paths converged. Across the low ground, movement hesitated. Shapes stalled, uncertain of where eyes lived. The pulses denied them certainty without declaring presence. This was the trick, though it felt older than tricks. Speak tonight in the language it already used. Show enough to be believed. Hide enough to survive. The shepherd lowered the hood and waited. No flare rose, no shot broke the spell. The signal had crossed from oddity to method, and the valley accepted it, holding still, as if the dark itself had been taught a new rule it could not yet break. Breath steadied, and the line felt time loosen its grip for the first time tonight, without fear returning. Momentum followed restraint, not speed. The lights stayed buried in palms, hoods cracked only long enough to pass meaning, never presence. From the left spur, a pulse slid down slope and stopped. From the right, a delayed echo answered, higher, thinner. The spacing told the men where ground opened and where it closed, where a body could move without sound and where it would betray itself. The shepherd adjusted for slope, for wet bark, for breath fog. He signaled when wind rose, paused when it fell, letting noise mask the smallest click. Each cue arrived once and vanished, refusing the enemy a rhythm to steal. Along the line, leaders translated light into motion. Two men shifted back a pace. Another crawled forward to seal a gap. Rifles angled where paths funneled, no voice carried. The valley learned their shape without seeing them. Across the low ground, figures tested the dark and met uncertainty. A step paused, a line bent. What should have been a rush thinned into caution, then into nothing. Minutes stretched and then folded. The pulses kept time without counting it, turning night into a map that updated itself. When fog thickened, signals shortened. When it lifted, they reached farther, still never long enough to burn an afterimage. A runner reached the rear ranks, guided by absence rather than light. Slipping through a corridor the pulses had opened and held. Supplies shifted. Wounded were eased back. The perimeter breathed. At last, movement on the far side unraveled. Shadows withdrew uphill, swallowed by trees that refused to remember them. The lights closed, palms cooled, and the wind carried only resin and wet earth again. Somewhere beyond sight, boots reconsidered their path, then turned away, leaving the cold to finish speaking in needles of quiet beneath the waiting branches above overhead. By dawn, the valley looked unchanged, but the perimeter had learned a new habit. Men rose stiffly, eyes rimmed red, checking ground that now felt legible. No bodies lay where they expected them. No flares burned out their secrets. The method traveled without orders. A sergeant copied intervals on his cuff. Another sketched pauses on a ration wrapper. Units passing through asked why the night felt thinner here, and the answer arrived as demonstration, not explanation. Within days, patrols borrowed the pulses to cross saddles and river bends. Columns slipped past listening posts that waited for noise and received none. Ambush plans collapsed under hesitation. A valley that had taken men began giving them back. Command noticed results before it noticed cause. Reports spoke of avoided contact, shortened nights, cleaner withdrawals. Doctrine bent slowly, the way wood does when warmed. What could not be written yet could be repeated. The shepherd did not follow the spread. He returned to paths he knew, animals tugging at rope. Light kept low for other reasons. His notebook stayed thin, charcoal smudged by weather, sketches already fading into habit elsewhere. Years later, instructors would teach restraint as technique, calling it discipline. They would cite physics, perception, the cost of certainty. Few would mention the hillside or the man who read it first. What endured was not the name, but the practice. Light used sparingly. Signals that refused to shout. Trust built from ground truth. As the season turned, the valley filled with ordinary sounds again. Wind in needles, water, moving stone. At night, nothing blinked any more, and the dark, deprived of answers, learned to keep its distance. Tracks softened, frost lifted, and the ground held memory quietly, as if it agreed to forget what patience had spared before dawn returned without witnesses or sound. Night vision favored contrast, not brightness. The eye learned edges by absence, by what did not belong, and the pulses respected that limit. They arrived too briefly to bleach detail, too low to throw silhouettes, tuned to how humans searched when afraid. Perception under stress narrowed. The mind hunted patterns and punished gaps with imagined threats. A steady flare offered certainty to attack. An irregular blink offered only doubt, and doubt slowed feet faster than fear ever could. Physics did the rest. Light skimmed damp air and broke apart, scattering just enough to be sensed without revealing source. Trees swallowed angles, fog shortened reach. Every condition that usually betrayed movement became an accomplice instead. The shepherd understood this without naming it. Animals taught him. Sheep moved when shadows lied. Wolves waited when they did not. Survival belonged to those who spoke the land's dialect. Military training prized dominance of space. The pulses seeded it, choosing influence over control. They suggested presence without confirming it, forcing opponents to imagine numbers and positions that never existed. Psychology filled the gaps. When vision failed, expectation took command. A delayed response felt like preparation. A shifted angle felt like encirclement. The enemy began planning against ghosts while the real line adjusted, breathing, holding. This was not technology defeating technology. It was restraint defeating assumption. Complexity collapsed under simplicity because simplicity moved faster through the mind. Long after equipment changed, the principle remained intact. Show less than expected. Let the observer complete the picture and tire themselves doing it. In classrooms, this would later be called misdirection, signal discipline, cognitive load. In the valley, it had been something quieter. Respect for limits, trust in terrain, and patience practiced until it felt like instinct. The night had not been conquered. It had been persuaded. Light did not argue. It asked a question and withdrew, leaving the dark to answer itself, until certainty dissolved and movement chose caution over commitment again without a single command ever needing to be spoken aloud. Long after the valley returned to maps and margins, the lesson surfaced in places that never learned its name. Control rooms dimmed screens. Pilots throttled back displays. Engineers hid complexity behind fewer signals, trusting users to move by feel instead of instruction. The pattern repeated because the mind had not changed. Faced with too much information, people froze or struck blindly. Given just enough, they adjusted. The shepherd's restraint reappeared as best practice, stripped of hillside and cold, dressed in modern language. Experts argued for clarity, for certainty delivered at scale. Quiet methods kept working anyway. A single indicator, timed well, outperformed a wall of data. Teams that listened to environment outlasted those that tried to dominate it. Authority learned slowly what the night had taught quickly. Outsiders noticed first. Farmers reading weather, sailors reading water, operators reading silence between signals. Wisdom arrived sideways, borrowed from trades that survived by attention rather than force. Contrast sharpened the truth. New tools promised omniscience. Simple cues delivered survival. The difference was not power, but humility, knowing what not to show, when not to speak. Memory softened the edges. No one remembered the cold in their bones, only the relief of mourning without loss. The idea remained because it traveled well, unburdened by credit, adaptable to new ground. Across decades, the same choice returned in different forms. Add more light or use it carefully. Speak louder or wait for the right pause. Command attention or earn it. Most nights, people chose noise. Sometimes they remembered restraint. In places where stakes still gathered quietly, markets, operating rooms, streets after dark, the old rule surfaced without ceremony. Influence beats exposure. Presence does not require announcement. Some lessons age into slogans. This one stayed practical. It asked nothing dramatic, only patience and trust in limits. The valley no longer needed to teach it. The world kept relearning it wherever silence offered room to decide before commitment closed the distance again. Years later, the valley looked ordinary. Grass stitched the scars. Pines leaned where they always had, patient with weather and forgetting. Night still arrived without announcement, and darkness still did what it had always done. What remained was a habit. Men who had been there kept their lights low in other places, hands remembering how to hood and unhood, minds recalling how doubt could be shaped instead of fed. They spoke less. They watched more. Survival had taught them a gentler authority. History wrote the night as an avoided engagement and moved on. No monument marked the hillside. The shepherd's notebook dissolved into weather and pockets and time. Credit scattered the way charcoal does when rubbed too often. Yet the pattern endured because it belonged to the land. Light was used as a question, not an answer. Presence was suggested, never declared. The dark, given nothing firm to strike, chose caution. And past, in the quiet after wars, wisdom often looks small. It hides in habits, in pauses, in the decision to show less than expected. Those choices do not shout, but they keep people alive. Standing on the ridge at dusk, one could imagine the pulses without seeing them, the way breath once steadied across a line that refused to break. Nothing blinked now, nothing needed to. They carried that memory forward, choosing patience over glare, timing over volume, letting environments speak first while they listened, adjusting, surviving, and leaving fewer scars behind everywhere always. If stories like this remind you what endurance really means, subscribe and keep these lessons alive. Night settled, the valley held its breath again, and somewhere within that held silence, a light learned to appear only long enough to be believed, then leave.